The aim of this paper is to foster further reflection on what has been called augmented reality media, what I will call AR for short, and on how these technologies relate to young people's ability to respond to God in their everyday choices. I will begin first by providing some basics on what exactly augmented reality is, where we can find it already today, and why it calls for specific attention on our part. Then I will explain why a common strategy for confronting modern technology is both crucial and insufficient in the face of augmented reality media. I'm going to call that strategy the ecstatic approach because it emphasizes our need to go out of ourselves, to let ourselves be drawn into a deep, complex, disciplined, and maybe even self-emptying engagement with realities outside of us. Now again, let me just emphasize, I find that strategy to be a condition of possibility for all good confrontation with modern technology. This is a both and kind of argument, not an either or kind of argument. The problem when it comes to AR is that AR media are themselves designed to pull us out towards the outside world. Hence, responses to technology that focus only on outward motion they're not going to help us make sufficiently careful and refined judgments about how to use or even design AR media with vocational discernment in mind. What we need is to balance that outward motion with the kind of interiority that can give us perspective on the distinctive ways in which AR pulls us beyond ourselves. I'm going to call that interiority cognitive self-responsibility. Finally, I will close by showing how Thomas Aquinas' account of memory training can offer us some good starting points for imagining how we might cultivate cognitive self-responsibility. Before I start, however, I want to identify one of my basic working assumptions when it comes to technology and vocational discernment. In his first message for World Communications Day in 2014, Pope Francis argued that a strongly critical assessment of the moral risks posed by digital media should lead Christians not to be less, but actually more disposed to participate in the social spaces opened up by those technologies. Like the road in the Good Samaritan story, the internet may well be a non-place that leaves people swindled, often abandoned, wounded, disoriented. It often can thwart our capacities for patient and careful reflection or for the full inclusion of the poor. But none of this, for Francis, authorizes Christians to pass by safely on the other side. To the contrary, what he calls the bruised church, which goes out to the streets, unquote, must also suffer with Christ the risk of drawing near to and taking personal responsibility for others in the digital highway. Here, too, the church must, quote, reach the peripheries of human existence, unquote. So I'm taking if we follow Francis on this argument, an adequate picture of vocational discernment in the face of modern technology must leave room for divine calls that lead people into the less life-giving spaces opened up by digital media. And it must explain how we're going to equip young people for such a calling, or how we will cooperate with God in the equipping of young people for such a calling. So let's begin then. So what is AR? We can start by calling to mind the example that put augmented reality on the map for many of us, the smartphone game Pokemon Go. If you're not familiar with it, Pokemon Go shows you a real-time display of your immediate surroundings on your smartphone screen, and it augments that display with animated imaginary creatures called Pokemon. So the players have to find and catch those creatures by exploring actual locations and by visiting existing landmarks or monuments. They also compete in teams for the possession of popular spaces, so-called gyms, and something like a massive game of capture the flag. And so by design, the game gets users to go outside and explore the world around them, often in ways that can elicit what we might call physically co-present interaction with other players or with the world. And of course, the goals and the rules of Pokemon will set the initial context for how those interactions run. But the mere fact that this other person or this place or landmark are right here next to me increases the opportunity for encountering that person or place in ways that will go well beyond the game and its rules. Okay, with this example of Pokemon Go in mind, let's now think about what makes AR distinct as a digital media technology. The most common way nowadays of defining AR is by contrast to virtual reality, VR. Virtual reality intercepts our sense perception with relatively comprehensive representations of events or places that lie beyond our body's proximate surroundings. In other words, VR creates the impression that I am elsewhere. And this could happen through VR goggles or simply through a really immersive video game. So VR. By contrast, AR layers additional sense objects or signs onto our ongoing experience of our proximate surroundings. It adds extra information, experiences, or frames of reference to the overall world that we already perceive ourselves to inhabit here and now. Another way to think about AR is as in terms of digital media that is designed to be less distracting. Traditional smartphone use notoriously involves directing our attention and after our bodies away from the world around us to focus instead on what is on the screen. By contrast, AR purports to be much more self-effacing and subordinate in its attentional demands. It is intended to integrate itself smoothly into the activities by which we engage the world around us. Importantly, I think this represents a serious effort on the part of computer engineers to steer technological development in a way that addresses long-standing cultural problems posed by digital media in the first place. So, for example, the central to the prehistory of Google Glass has been the Georgia Tech engineer Tad Starner, who since the early 90s has been pioneering various forms of wearable computing that can integrate devices more smoothly into everyday life. So that, for example, using the device does not require looking away from other people. Now, of course, this may raise as many problems as it answers. We might prefer sometimes to stick with media that forces us to choose and to make it clear to others when we are and when we are not tapping into the cloud. For example, going on a date with someone who doesn't periodically check his smartphone may or may not be preferable to going on a date with somebody with a Google Glass who can presumably check your profile the whole time and maybe have pickup lines scrolling down during the whole date. Nevertheless, we should not simply dismiss AR's search for greater deference to everyday activities and to the real world. All technology, indeed all representation, is at least tenuously parasitic on the real world, but AR thrives on the relatively open acknowledgement of that dependence. This gives AR a distinctive ambiguity that I will return to later. Before going on, just as an aside point, I want to resist the temptation to think of AR as something that's simply lying in the future. Once you think about AR as media that layer information onto our daily activities through a kind of smooth integration into those activities, we might notice how this is already present in devices we are already using now. Take, for example, GPS apps like Google Maps. By now, these apps provide much more than maps and their routes. They position us along those routes in ways that point easily back to our actual field of vision. Even if not visually, because you're still using a smartphone, then the auditory feedback, there's multisensory feedback, and it helps you point back to the world around you, or at least it's supposed to. They suggest additional destinations or route changes in view of interests that we are likely to have. They provide auditory and visual feedback on our travel progress, and they are increasingly receptive to our voice commands. This is already a well-integrated layering of extra information onto our broader engagements with our proximate surroundings. AR there then is already closer to home than we may realize, and the questions it will pose will matter even if Pokemon Go or even Google Glass turn out to be relatively marginal fads. The deeper logic at work is in a very real sense already with us in apps that lots of people use fairly regularly. How can we best confront augmented reality in a sufficiently critical and fruitful way? One strong contender is what I'm calling the ecstatic approach or response to modern technology. Here I would include a number of critical and constructive frameworks that, however much they may differ in some respects or in others, they generally place a strong and central emphasis on how technology relates to our ability to see and respond to reality properly, to the world, to nature, to others, to God. Modern technology is set to train us to see reality as no more than raw material to be manipulated for whatever purposes we decide. Hence, we need practices that foster deep and complex engagements with the world around us. Such engagements anchor and govern our uses of technology by drawing us out of ourselves and pulling us into serious commitments to things and ends that are not simply our own creations. These commitments can then orient and delimit and govern our technology use while curbing our tendency to reduce nature and other people to mere instruments that are in service to whatever ends we posit or decide for them. For example, rather than sinking into the sense of infinite access and individual personalization offered by music apps like Spotify, I could take up the hard labor of learning to play a musical instrument with others. That kind of discipline would deepen my responsivity to thick musical traditions and to the initiatives of other people, in this case, the other musicians. That responsivity, in turn, could reorient, delimit, and maybe even enrich my uses of Spotify. Hence, one of the pluses to the ecstatic approach is that it doesn't necessarily call you to get rid of the technology because it simply puts it in its place. Now that you have these practices, they anchor it and you can keep it in ways that now have perspective. The ecstatic approach has proved especially attractive to Christian technology critics like Albert Borgman, Ivan Illich, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, and Francis's main source here, Romano Guardini. It isn't hard to see why. Besides its intrinsic merits, the ecstatic approach also gives you a clear way to locate the problem of modern technology within big themes in the tradition. For example, Augustine's account of pride or superbia as the root of sin. From this perspective, the problem of technology has to do with not curving in upon ourselves, not grasping for infinite control over the world, and instead being drawn and opened with the vulnerability of faith and love to the common gift of creation and of creation's future with God. Vocational discernment is not Christian unless it leads into such a journey. That is why a confrontation with modern technology in service to young people's religious discernment should take up the ecstatic approach as a necessary and crucial response. That approach, I just want to throw out there a little bit, can also help us articulate more specific questions about AR. For example, will my use of this particular AR application encourage me to welcome and discover reality as a gift, or to instead manipulate it as raw material with no intrinsic meaning beyond my own choices? Is Pokemon Go inviting me to wrestle more deeply with nature, with the environment, with the human environment, in all of the stubbornness in which the world can interrupt my desires and my choices? Or does it flatter my desire for a world that is convenient, easily known, and compliant with my will? What other practices could anchor and orient my use of Pokemon Go? Could new AR media be developed in ways that are more likely to encourage an exodus from the self towards the risky wilderness of God's world and of God's future with the world? So for all these reasons, I think the ecstatic approach is crucial. Unfortunately, however, I think when it comes to AR, it is not enough. And to see why, let's come back to the more common example of GPS navigation apps. There's an important sense, I think, in which these apps can form users to confront the ills of a technological society in ways that are both problematic and, at the same time, far from negligible. Imagine you are on a road trip in a car with very young children. The kids just woke up from a nap. It's an hour past their normal lunchtime. You've already taught them much about patience today. And you don't want to keep stuffing them with goldfish. All of this means you may have no more than 15 minutes to find a good place to eat and let them run around for a while, or all hell will break loose. If you're a skilled user of Google Maps, there is a surprisingly good chance that in 5 minutes you can find, within relatively easy driving distance, a locally owned and maybe even locally sourced restaurant with ecologically friendly options, located close to the cultural center of whatever small town you happen to be driving by. No more McDonald's. Now you can, in a limited but real way, respect and enjoy your natural and human ecologies in a somewhat serendipitous respite without torturing your children in the process. Now, let's be honest. These early uses of AR also play into some worrisome aspects of digital media more broadly. They do still tend to flatter us as masters of our environments who can wield technology to avoid confronting a messy and stubborn world. They fail to challenge modern technology's emphasis on the efficient management of time, of space, of bodies. And the apps only work by first reducing the whole world to manipulable information. This puts a lot of power in the hands of developers who don't always care about our well-being. And it's also precisely the myopic kind of knowledge that worries countless technology critics. But again, despite these problematic, formative, and structural undercurrents, on the surface of everyday life, these apps can allow for interactions with our natural and human ecologies that seem far better than what most of 20th century media offered us, and which provide a partial but real response to various problems with mobility and ecological responsibility that are typical of modern technological societies. That's what I mean by drawing attention to AR's ambiguity. It isn't just that AR makes life more efficient and convenient at the cost of pushing us in some bad formative directions. Rather, it is that AR is distinctively capable of allowing users to pursue really good as well as really bad formative journeys, often at the same time, and again in ways that will continue to be sold to us as better alternatives to prior digital media. The limit to ecstatic approaches is that they don't equip us to think carefully about that kind of ambiguity. Prudence with regard to when or how to use AR will require fine-grained and careful judgments about how to negotiate the complex set of good and bad formative influences that are packed into the device or into its prescribed use. To make those judgments, users need to think about the more comprehensive formative pathways through which they're moving as they confront and engage a whole ecosystem of technologies in front of them. Can I expect this particular habitual use of GPS apps to negotiate their good as well as their bad formative tendencies in a way that will, over the long haul, move me in the right direction? That depends on several factors. What kind of life is God calling me to live? What formative risks does this vocation require me to bear and confront in a world where accompanying one's neighbor often involves treading in morally dangerous cultural ecologies? What habits must I cultivate in order to pursue that vocation well, to resist bad formative pathways, and to make the best of real benefits inherent in some of these devices? And how nimbly can I relate these various factors together in my practical reasoning? Notice that to answer these questions fully, I must invest a fair bit of attention on myself. I need to work deliberately and regularly at identifying and cultivating the interior resources that will help me pursue my broadest goals in this particular environment given an honest assessment of how technologies tend to shape my cognitive and bodily life. Those resources will certainly include virtues like temperance, but they also equally are in need of just shaping one's memory and imagination and putting content into it in a particular way. This is why I would like to close by suggesting that for that kind of interiority and attention to oneself, we look at figures like Thomas Aquinas and how he argues that you actually need memory, and not just a well-stocked memory, but a memory that you constantly attend to and form well in a deliberate way. Memory for Aquinas is not simply something that you form, something that's a byproduct of good, virtuous action. You have to think about how you are forming your memory. We might balk a little bit at the amount of attention on oneself this might require. However, if you remember that for Aquinas, full-blown prudence also involves the gift of counsel, by which our act of prudence is responsive to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. And if we thereby think about prudence as also a second personal action, it's a response to the Spirit, it is discernment, then we can think about all that time and attention on oneself as so many small acts of loving hospitality by which we are cultivating a kind of interior garden in preparation for the divine visitor. Thank you very much.